So, thank you so much for your patience again. Welcome to TITUBANTI TESTI 7. This is the first binomio. This is going to be in English. This is the reason why I'm chairing this session in English. As you know, Del and Nicoletta, I'm not going to introduce you. I normally ask the speakers to introduce themselves. And normally we kind of expect from the person who actually proposed the text to say why he or she, in this case she, of course, Nicoletta, was interested in discussing this text, this particular text with us. But of course, as you know, that you are the new person here within this circle of people. So you're going to be the first, and yours is the floor. The only limit is that you have really 20 minutes. Otherwise, you can tell whatever you like about yourself and about the text.
Okay, 1 second. Just get my screen share working. So yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. I've been a fan of this format for very long, and as well as being a fan of Lucretius, and so I was delighted to participate. I will say that I have somewhat of a more experimental approach to this, as I warned Marco. I like this model of the binomio, and I'm going to try to sort of live up to it in what I have to say. So a little bit about me. I teach Latin at Vassar College. I received my PhD at NYU last year in 2022, and I write about eco-criticism in Latin literature. I'm sort of interested in representations of the environment, and in particular of raw materials as sort of vectors for thinking about human and non-human encounters in literature. But I'm also interested in this sort of in the binary of work and life. So I have an edited volume coming out that I'm co-authoring that Marco is part of, called The Working Lives of Ancient Rome, which is all about the sort of the various encounters between the subjective and the objective in our approach to literature. How does the work that we do, either as scholars, or how did the work that ancient Romans do, bleed into the way that they thought about their lives? So that's sort of the spirit of what I'm talking about here today. The sort of this confluence between the sort of this work-life angle and the sort of my eco-critical approach to raw materials. And so I'll be talking about two of those today. So I'm doing a portion screen share. Unfortunately, I'm on my laptop, and it doesn't work in quite the same way that or on my desktop. So can everybody see my PowerPoint now? Is that the screen share?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll get started. Let's see, there's a chat. Okay, yes. Thank you. So before we get to sorry about that. Before we get to the passage, the wonderful passage that Nicoletta chose for us, I wanted to start somewhere else in Lucretius and talk a little bit about centaurs. So in my favorite argument against the existence of the centaur, Lucretius points out that a horse and a man could not share the same body for the simple fact that horses age faster than men. As such, the quadruped part of the organism would be a full-grown adult, while the human is still a perplexed infant wailing in terror at the top of a galloping frame. As humorous as this corporeal description is, Lucretius does what he often does and pushes his analysis further, making the arresting psychological insight that the result of this lack of corporeal synchronicity between in the monstrous binomio d'animale would be a profound affective discordia in which tastes and desires and habits would always remain in misalignment. I wanted to open my brief remarks about Lucretian weaving with this bipolar passage because it gives voice to one of the ways in which I am most hesitant as a reader of classical texts. The provocation of the series is to facilitate mixture and collaboration from different readerly directions, and I often find myself drawn to such binomial approaches. But my effort to weave together different points of view or points of reading seems always to end up in inhabiting this problem of the centaur. One half always ends up aging faster than the other half. The work tends to be a lot slower than life. The problem is immediately multiplied when you take such an approach to Lucretius, who himself is a most bipolar of ancient authors, such that he even attracts this infamous reading of the anti-Lucrezio Lucre, right? The anti-Lucretius who thwarts his own arguments throughout this work as a kind of id fighting against the textual superego of Epicurean doctrine. And so I want to sort of offer up this centaur here we have on the screen, Scylla, as a muse for thinking binomially between two halves of our brains and two halves of a textual interpretation, because I think this text that has been selected for us warrants that. So just to start with an actual reading of the passage, and the image in the background is a photograph that I took of a knitted a scarf that my mother made. So it's the personal is here with the professional. So plaited garments came before garments of woven cloth. Woven cloth comes after iron, because iron is needed for equipping the loom, nor without it can such smoothness be given to the treadles and spindles, shuttles, and noisy leash rods. In nature made men work in wool before womankind, for the male sex is always far more superior in skill and more clever, until the austere farmers made it a reproach, so that the men agreed to leave it in women's hands and themselves to share in the hard labor, and the hard work hardened their bodies and hands. The passage that we're tasked with reading today on the history of the fabric arts presents a series of antinomies that provoke me to think about the different readers within me that are plaited together at any given moment of reception. In my brief remarks, I'll offer an unconventional reaction to the passage in the spirit of Lucretius' impossible centaur, first focusing on the first four lines and the relationship between braiding, weaving, metalworking, and woodworking. I offer two different readings of the passage, one hard and one soft. First, I'll talk a little bit about it from my perspective as a person writing a book about raw materials. And then second, I'll sort of approach it as more of a subjective reader, thinking about my own personal history with Lucretius. But hard first. In my current book project, tentatively titled The Bones of Echo-Raw Materiality in Latin Literature, I explore Roman accounts of human encounters with material, plant, and animal substances as a way to consider the genealogy of environmental ethics in Latin literature, rather than simply offering metonyms of Roman wealth or convenient metapoetic metaphors for passive nature transformed by the creative agency of the human mind. Raw materials are figured often as the victims of violence, as practitioners of passive resistance to Roman violence, and as uncredited co-authors of Roman culture. By tracing the various veins of raw materiality through Latin literature at any given era, I show that Romans saw the world in a manner much like what we would now call ecological, and that it focuses on nature not as an aesthetic backdrop of human action, but as a bustling community of organisms and forces, of which the human is only one limited part. Lucretius's account of the origins of weaving offers a highly condensed theory of the interrelation of multiple different technologies and vital processes that exemplifies this ecological approach. Weaving itself as the process of working with fabrics is one of those technologies, but there's also the interrelated technology of loom making, which expands the scale of weaving through distinct technological expertise. The third technology looming behind that of the fabric arts is that of metalworking, which enables the creation of looms in the first place. I'm very interested in tracing out how the Roman authors sort of make sense of these different flows of matter into different technological assemblages and tracing the sources of different substances. And if we do that with Lucretius, if we say, okay, well, here we have the fabric arts and metallurgy sort of and woodworking all sort of jammed together, we sort of find that Lucretius has already given us the tools to think through this. So earlier chapters of Lucretius's Anthropology set the stage for this, acting as prerequisites for our understanding of the technological developments that are described in the passage we're reading today. Of particular importance here is Lucretius's account of the discovery of metallurgy, just about 100 lines earlier in around the 1250s of Book 5. Which recount this theory that was circulated among some Hellenistic and Roman authors like Posidonius and Seneca, all the way as late as Seneca, that the origin of metallurgy was occasioned by a forest fire. The fire could have been kindled any number of ways, naturally, accidentally, or deliberately. But however it started, it caused rivulets of molten metal to spring up from boiling subterranean veins and cool in earthen hollows. Later, when the metal had hardened, passers-by were taken by the color and shine and smoothness of the material and observed that if the shape of the hollows, that it kept the shape of the hollows in which it was hardened. Seeing this, humans realized that the substance, if melted once, could be melted again and shaped into weapons, but also, of all things, woodworking tools. Thus, there's a cycle that linking woodworking and metallurgy that's established here. The very same material, namely wood, that initially burned to melt the metals in the first place, were now the objects of woodworking that use the metal tools that were softened and hardened again in order to make that possible. So here we see the end of that description that kind of brings this all to fruition. The idea came into their heads that these metals, once liquefied by heat, could flow into any form and shape of things, and moreover, could be led by beating into sharp and slender pointed tips, in order that they might furnish tools, in order that they might cut down forests and hew timber and plane down smooth slats, and also be bore and pierced and perforated. And here we see a painting of this event, the forest fire by Pierre de Cosimo, and the chaotic nature of this painting is really interesting. On the bottom left-hand corner, you see what is probably a representation of the molten metals underneath the trees. But all throughout, you also see a lot of animals, including this bizarre human-animal hybrid, an animal body with a human face. Here you see sort of humans kind of trying to deal with the animals. And this is because in the description Lucretius offers, he says, we don't know how the forest fire was started, but it might have been started on purpose by humans who were using it to hunt, to kick animals out of the woods in order to steer them into nets. And so this moment of the forest fire is really sort of ecological moment, because it sort of involves a lot of different humans and non-humans, both animal, plant, and mineral, all sort of caught together in this chaotic moment of sort of coexistence. And what is more, Lucretius's account of the origin of metallurgy lays bare a number of key aspects of a materialist conception of technology, and the interrelation between materials like wood and metal, which are here enchained in a sequence of mutual effect, wood changing metal, changing wood with its initial cause unclear. They are not, to invoke a metaphysical analogy often used when talking about raw materials, an inert mass like a marble block waiting to be informed by an external active agent. The material cause, in contrast, is diffuse, multifarious, and as it were, overflows form, resisting the strictures of the hylomorphic model of matter on the one hand and form on the other. This flow of matter, to borrow a phrase from Deleuze and Guattari, is always moving, changing, looping back its course, intersecting with other flows and spinning off into ever-widening spirals. nor does the cyclical transformation of metal and wood reify a stark binary between art and nature on the one hand, but rather sort of a choreography or a cycling between the two. Bearing in mind Cosimo's chaotic ecosystem of fire, we can see how the Lucretian account of weaving understands technological history as the rippling effects of this initial impetus of the interwoven forces and lives. The metal used to reshape plant matter and work animal matter itself bubbled up from the conflagration encounter between mineral, plant, and animal living in earlier generations. This development bears on our account of weaving in multiple respects. In one way, the juxtaposition of metalworking and woolworking seem to prefigure the hard and soft dichotomies of the sexist account of gender roles that follow. The men, in other words, do the hard work of smithing, while the women, the soft labor of the fabric arts. Thus, if some have argued about Book 5 of De Rerum Natura, the strands of the hard and soft are braided together down a long line of technological history. But when we account for what the passage leaves out, the animal bodies and plant matter that subtend the processes of moving from braiding to weaving, wood to metal to fabric, we see that the picture becomes much more tangled and complicated, non-linear, non-binary. A variety of forces and elements come together to generate this knot in the technological phylum of weaving. The hard metal itself had to be softened repeatedly in order to be workable, while the wool required domestication of animals. Contribution of animal bodies. This account is less an oscillation between hard and soft as so much of a harmonics of different intensities that all coexist. Well, so much for the horse end of my argument. The idea that this passage sort of can introduce an ecological way of thinking about technology in Lucretius's anthropological narrative. We could stop there, but in the remaining few minutes, I'd like to briefly address the human half of my centaur argument, which will seem sort of radically dichotomous and distinct from what I've said already. But as I move towards ending, I want to ask a question that this passage makes me ask, which is, where do we start? Namely, where do we start a work of interpretation? Where does the weave of a reading begin? We could start, as I have done here, with a question, but questions are usually loaded with something that came before a first reading or first encounter. No questions are something that we cannot start, but only restart. We could, like our students, start with a claim about how something has been true since the dawn of time. That kind of grandiose throat clearing is and is not in the spirit of Lucretius. It's certainly the case that Epicureans struggled with an account of beginnings. For them, the world composed entirely of particles bouncing around chaotically in the void was once simply an infinitely wide shower of atoms falling straight down until the clinamen, a random uncaused swerve of one atom, caused them to start bumping into each other, pinballing out of control. This chaotic fluid motion led to the atomic coherence in random ways, forming everything from our universe from pinball machines to black holes to the concept of loneliness. But at a certain point, we must begin where we begin is really an arbitrary matter of rhetoric. My impulse to start reading, an equally legitimate impulse I have for where to start reading is where I myself began with Lucretius over 10 years ago in an undergraduate class. Overconfident and fresh out of elementary Latin, my first intermediate Latin class was a Lucretius class. We read Bonnie Cato's very generous student commentary, and the class was taught by the head of the University of South Carolina Classics program, Catherine Kastner, pictured here on the right. I found Dr. Kastner to be one of the most intimidating people I've ever met, always rushing, always in a hurry, always sort of bustling you with a nervous impatience. But it was really in front of that Lucretius class, it was the first time that I ever saw her completely unrushed and at peace. I remember very little about that far distant past. It's kind of a messy chaos, like the forest fire that began all of this weaving. The class was a hybrid mix of intermediate and advanced Latin students, graduate students in the USC's comparative literature program, and one professor of English who was auditing the class. I remember understanding virtually nothing about the hierarchies involved in that room, and at one point I enthusiastically recommended that the auditing professor enroll in one of his colleagues' 300 level Enlightenment literature classes, not knowing that they were colleagues. But perhaps more clearly, I remember an anecdote that Kathy told about her perverse joy of first reading Lucretius on the sacrifice of Iphigenia in her all-girls Catholic boarding school as a girl. At the time, I was a traumatized evangelical wrestling with the angels of my own burgeoning atheism, and her anecdote endeared me more to Lucretius, the poet of the void. Kathy Kastner was most influential on my academic and personal trajectory. She encouraged me to apply to the University of South Carolina's Honors College within the university, and once admitted, helped me take advantage of the various funding and travel resources the Honors College made available to me. In hindsight, she was a pretty traditional reader who more than once in my upper level Latin poetry classes made recourse to metrical convenience to explain a particular textual oddity. But nevertheless, she inspired me by insistently, almost imperiously fostering my own philological competence. And because of that course, I've always been predisposed to see Lucretian verbal echoes in every other Latin text I read. And honestly, I'm honestly more inclined to begin my reading here and not with the forest fire, not with the dissertation, with the personal and subjective rather than the objective and analytical. But how does that make you feel, I wonder? If you're anything like me, Memmius, you're a little uneasy and confused. Is it not rigorous, unscientific, navel-gazy? Is there perhaps some justification for the autoethnography, but autophilology? Is it just soft work and not the hard work, cold objectivity that we strive for? Indeed, what does it do? What should it do? My own personal history with Lucretius bends to the same rhetorical metaphors, but almost feels more confessional, more contingent, more worthless. But that Latin class was as much a beginning of interpretation as the hypothetical forest fire that caused the earth to bleed with iron, and to say anything close to exhaustive about this passage requires that these two threads, the hard and soft, the work and life, objective and subjective, infant and horse, be knitted together. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to use it to start discussion or talk about something completely different. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Del. That was really, really nice. And you touched upon many interesting and also personal. And I'm very glad that you were taking my invitation so seriously. I always kind of invite the speakers to produce exactly what you just did. So I'm very thrilled now to listen to Nicoletta, who is the one, Nicoletta Bruno from Greifswald, who is the one who actually proposed this fascinating text. So, Nicoletta, you have 20 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Marco, for this great, fantastic opportunity. And thank you so much, Del, for meeting you virtually and for your fascinating talk. So it is quite predictable because I have been working on Lucretius for almost a decade. That's why it's quite predictable that I choose a text. I picked up a text from the Rerum Natura, and I worked on the lines immediately before that one. So on 1105 till 1349, I wrote a commentary on that lines. So, and when I start reading the line afterwards, I was shocked because in the first 11 lines, I found so many issues, so many problems, textual and of course problems of content and nature. And that's why I decided but for other reason as well that I will explain why I choose that. I'm currently at the Alfred Krupp Wissenschaft Kolleg in Greifswald, which is an institute for advanced studies. And I'm working on writing archaeologies in Roman literature, so archaeologies and general accounts of early cultural history. I have a PowerPoint presentation as well, like Dell, and so I just have to share my screen. Yeah, now it's Can you see?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay, great. So it's certainly not surprising that the Raro Natura is full of issues of various kinds. And in our Titubante testo that I've chosen for this meeting, I want to bring to your attention these questions raised in analyzing these 11 lines. So first, this is a sort of provisional title of this paper, Archaeology of Textile Manufacturing, a gender issue. So first, man as inventors of weaving. So the first question is historical or mythological evidence to support this statement. So is there a mythological or historical evidence in Lucretius? Second, what is the possible explanation for Lucretius? Second issue is a gender issue, so the superiority of the masculine gender over the feminine, declared by Lucretius by the verb praestare and by Solertius, and the role of the severi agricole. So the first 4 lines refer directly to the previous section of lines, and the excursus on technology and warfare, in particular on the use of metals for weapons and of animals in fighting tactics. In lines 1350, 1353, the use of metals serves to produce clothes, to weave canvases, since iron is essential to build a loom. Therefore, Lucretius in 1350 refers to a prehistoric period, the same age as line 772, 1104. On the other hand, from 1104 onwards, Lucretius refers to a phase of the most advanced civilization. He moves from a protohistoric era to a historical one, which coincides with the birth of the first forms of government in which the best man stood out. There were the creation of the first laws, cults, and religion. However, in lines 1241 and 1280, concerning the discovery of metals, Lucretius returns to prehistory, to the phase of discovery of natural resources which precedes the phase of invention. But let's have a quick look at the first lines. So plated garments came before garments of woven cloth. In the commentaries, including Bailey, Costa, and Gale, is recalled Diogenes of Enoanda, fragment 12, column 1, second, which describes the way in which first men protected themselves from the cold and bad weather, taking refuge in caves and covering their bodies with both foliage and plants or with animal skins, which were the first garments not yet sewn. So here, in the translation by Smith, as they protected them either with foliage, with plants, or even for they were already killing animals with skin, gave them the notion of clothes, not yet plated. So woolen clothes comes after iron, because iron is needed for equipping the loom. Lucretius gives a logical explanation. Woolen clothes cannot exist without the discovery of the iron, which saw it prevail over other metals due to its hardness and better resistance than copper and gold in the construction of tools, including weapons. So the logic ratio behind every invention which follows the fortuitous discovery is linked to the useful and the necessary in Lucretius' argument, nec ratione alia possum tam levia gigni. No, without it can such smoothness to be given to. And line 1353 consists of an accumulatio of technical terms related to textile manufacturing. A recent lexicographical tool, the Latin lexicon of textile, clothes, adornments, materials, and techniques of ancient Rome, collects these terms, and in Cilia, that is particularly difficult in the text, as for example, Doifert put it in crux, put a crux before in Cilia, what seems to be the most problematic, as it is a neutral term of uncertain origin, which has no equivalent in ancient Greek. So it is the treadle of a spinning machine, moving the wheel in order to pass the thread along. Like any other word related to the weaving process, the spindle, fusus, may also refer to the parcae, who spin on it the threads of the destiny in Virgil Eclogues 446. And Pliny the Elder mentioned an ancient Roman tradition which forbade women from taking the spindle with them if they had to make a trip, for enemies could then benefit from their work. Both passages mentioned here associate the craft of weaving to women. In 1354, Lucrezio states that it was nature that forced men to devote themselves to weaving, spinning wool, et facere ante viros lanam natura coegit. In the following verses, Lucretius also gives its explanation of the reason why it was a characteristic inherent into the nature of man, which makes them suitable for dedicating themselves to weaving. So the question to ask here is, are there any other histories of the origin of the Kulturgeschichte that support this specific point of Lucretius' account? For example, let's see what Seneca writes about it in Epistle 90, paragraph 20, reporting the lost Kulturgeschichte by Posidonius. Epistle 90 is a treatise on human progress, combining divine providentialism and the inescapable necessity of philosophy, the true and only path to happiness. Seneca claims that his source, Posidonius, first tries to describe how the threads that create clothes intertwine, and then claims that the art of weaving was invented by wise men, sapientes, forgetting that a more ingenious system was later found. Now I show you the translation, so it's easier to follow. In quoting, and he quotes, Seneca quotes 3 lines from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Seneca's history of humanity appears as a contrast between the idealized past and the negatively degraded and denigrated present, the progress of arts to the contemporary moral regress, like in the description, for example, here in this paragraph, of the transparent clothes so popular in the Neronian age, but completely useless. So Seneca's Epistle 90 followed the same pattern of prehistory of Lucretius' Kulturgeschichte. In fact, here in the text, we see that Seneca continues with the farmers in the same way as Lucretius, from lines 1361. Afterwards, he deals with agriculture. But not only of Lucretius, this pattern is found starting from Democritus and also in Diodorus in Vitruvius. And it was reconstructed in the famous and old famous study by Thomas Cole, the famous Democritus and the Sources of Greek Anthropology, until more recently in a study by Giovanni Zagon, Seneca's Epistle 90. But in Epistle 90, Seneca tells us that according to Posidonius, weaving was invented by wise men, and the sapientes were predictably men. So Lucretius in the 5th book recognizes that either chance or the ingenium of the first man premised an initial development of progress, always threatened by the degeneration of vices. The fate of humanity is entrusted to Epicurus, the authentic beginning of a more advanced state of civilization. The cacumen, the peak of civilization, is in the last lines of this book, without which man would be prey to their fears, primarily to death, fears of death and of fears of gods. and slaves to their unnecessary desires. So the Lucretian narrative moves on a non-teleological and non-theological basis, but it is deeply naturalistic and rational. But at the same time, it gives a message and a moral didactic teaching of freedom. So weaving the loom, both weaving and the loom, as we have seen in the aforementioned passage from Pliny the Elder, was a purely female activity and tool, of course. Since the time of Homer, the loom has been associated with women. In the Odyssey with Penelope, whose canvas becomes an instrument of power, of self-assertion and control. But it was the spider who, according to Democritus in fragments 154, the Scrants, had taught humanity the art of weaving. And according to Plutarch, the web it waves, admirable for the fineness of the thread, is a model of perfection for the same weavers. Hesiod then specified that the most suitable day for a woman to set up the loom and devote herself to work is the one in which the spider unwinds the threads of its web. This is in the Works and Days. The myth of Arachne, this highly skilled weaver whose insolent pride Minerva punishes by transforming her into a spider, is the myth linked to the art of weaving. And there is a beautiful article by Giampiero Rosati about that. It came out in 2004 in Dictina, La strategia del ragno, ovvero la rivincita di Arachne. And the story of Arachne is told in the 6th book of the Metamorphosis, in the lines 145, and appears also in Pliny in Naturalis Historia, in the catalogue of inventors. Here we have the text in translation. And according to Pliny, the Egyptians invented weaving, and Arachne, myth-historical protagonist of the origins of this craft, invented linen clothes and nets. So therefore, we invented weaving, probably both men and women. Archaeological and paleontological evidence has shown that the wise people were both men and women. A Homo sapiens was joined by a lady sapiens to take up the title of a famous and very recent book by French archaeologists and paleontologists about the latest discoveries on women in the Paleolithic. But let's move to the most controversial point here, which is the last lines, and which raised the controversy, leading to a reading of a patriarchal Lucretius. So if on the one hand, the commentaries of Bailey and Costa do not seem to focus on the matter, and it is not surprising given that Bailey's commentary was published in the 60s and Costa's very concise commentary in the 80s. It is also not surprising because in ancient times, affirming that the male gender was superior to the female gender was taken for granted. And the scholars refer to a passage from Plato, Res Publica, and in book 455c. But it is equally not so far from what Aristotle said about women in several passages of the De Generatione Animalium. Monica Gale in her commentary dwells on the possible ironic nuance in Lucretius' portrayal of man's decision to turn over weaving to the weaker sex, especially as regards the meaning to give to the adjective solertius, that literally means more astute, which in line 1009 and 1010 of the same book must clearly be interpreted in an ironic way. And it certainly isn't the first case in which Lucretius resorts to irony. However, the lines have been interpreted by Georgia Nugent in 1994 essay Magna Mater, the female in Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, as a clear anti-feminist position by Lucretius, in which she claims that in De Rerum Natura, women would have no role in inventing and producing anything. Nugent wrote, I quote textually, "Then why are the women the weavers now?" Again, the poet has no argument to offer that does not beg the question. The suggestion that male weavers, shamed by hardy farmers, transferred textile production to women already assumes the gender division of labor. Men win alone on all counts that of priority. They thought of weaving first, and that of utility. After all, weaving is a soft business. So men turned to the hard work of agriculture and thus improved themselves. So she concludes that the female is reduced to matter, to the reproductive function. And a reply to this argument was in Don Fowler's essay, The Feminine Principle, Gender in the Natura. It is possible to gender the poem, both the reader as a male and the subject matter as the female. And Fowler has well demonstrated how Lucretius is also very critical of pursuit of wealth and power, the image of male citizen, especially for the Roman elite. And I quote Fowler, "Where masculinity was so tied to the cursus honorum, and anyone who stood aside from the pursuit of political power was seen as emasculated and effeminate." The question is also taken up by Alison Sharrock more recently in 2006 in her essay, Gendered Reading of Lucretius. And moving back to the lines, the verb praestare, with which Lucretius defines man as superior to women, already occurs in 1105, 1107. More and more daily, they were shown how to change their former life and living for new ways and for fire by those who were preeminent in genius and strong in mind. So great men change society. The strongest man, not only the common man, according to a naturalistic law of the strongest. In my commentary on those lines, I dwell on the verb praestare and rigere, which insist on the intellectual and above all physical superiority of this man. And I compare this line with Sallust Catilin, chapter 2. It is assumed that among their qualities there were praestantia et rigor, and solers means several things, like being full of devices, of expedients, clever, skilled, ingenious, resourceful. And some of these features are the product of social conditioning. So Lucretius seems to be in line with what it is stated in these lines and with the community's opinion on women carried forward by Plato and Aristotle. Lastly, I would dwell on the role of the Severi Agricole, who believed that it was a vice for men to devote themselves to such a soft activity as weaving, and the choice of the term concedere, to permit, is really interesting. So allowing women to devote themselves to that craft. So once again, to underline the difference in social role between men and women and the dependence of women on the male will. So it seems to see a link with the preface of Cato's De Agricultura, which sees the strongest men and the best soldiers come for the farming class. So on the other hand, it is from the farming class that the bravest men and the sturdiest soldiers come. So if great men change society according to the Roman ideal, it is easier for those men to come from humble and hard work in the fields, which can strengthen their limbs and hands in hard work. So now I leave you with a series of questions, and I look forward to hearing from you and to discussing together in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta, for a wonderfully rich and very erudite presentation. A lot of interesting things you mentioned, and I'm sure that the discussion will be rich. I only would like to say that I enjoyed this text very much. As you might know, I am a reader of ancient technical texts, and this text gave me the opportunity to think really about different things. I mean, a comparison, an immediate comparison would be that with Columella at the end of his work, book 13. This is also devoted to the Vidlica, the women, the women farmer, the lady farmers, and that was also interesting in that particular case to observe how a certain art can be produced and maintained by female actors. I would like just to say something about Del's presentation. I mean, so many things to discuss really, but I'm eager to open the discussion. I would like to say that I feel sympathetic with this kind of rediscovering, like a text. Always a classical text is always like a sort of thing that we are used to read with no surprise. And in my opinion, and this is something I do share with Del, is that ecocriticism and the ecocritical approach offers us the opportunity really to undo this habituated kind of reading. And I thought this is very interesting that Del tried again, I mean, to uncover, I mean, like the novelty. On the other hand, and I'm so glad because you both are embodying really the logic and the dialectic of TITUBANTI TESTI. On the other hand, Nicoletta produced a wonderfully convincing textual background, right? I mean, you gave us a lot of interesting inputs to think along these lines of Lucretius. Okay, I stop now this delirious but enthusiastic. So really, thank you so much. And it is a common practice that I give the word to the first reader. But then, if you don't mind, it is better to open the discussion. Let's see if there are. I don't see any hands, but I mean, feel free. We are not so many. Feel free to jump in and ask a question or present an observation, whatever you like. No? Okay, then I would say that we follow our common practice that, I mean, a usual practice that Del could offer a brief reaction to Nicoletta's.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was really very convincing and interesting and very it's this hard philology, right? This is what the horse philology as opposed to the human philology. Oh, I see that I was in the binary I was doing. I see Craig has a question. Maybe Craig, would you like to go while I sort of ruminate on my thoughts?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Not really a question, just an observation, but see if anybody has anything to think about it. What I was really, not surprisingly, those of you who know me, I was interested in the workings of gender in this passage. So Nicoletta, I found really helpful what you were pointing out. What struck me when I reread this passage was the language of soft and hard. Mm-hmm. Right? So in general, of course, durum is connotated with masculinity and molle with femininity. But the opening lines, like what's going on there? So the sequence of nexilis ante fuit vestis quam textile tegmen textile post ferrum est, quia ferro tela parat. So he's emphasizing the need for ferrum to enable weaving. But ferrum is, of course, durum. And yet, so in the next line, we have levia, which is not the same as mollia, but similar. And then the passage ends with, as you pointed out, this very intense repetition of the language of hardness, the last two lines.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any thoughts about that? Sort of how, the underlying.
Thank you. Yes. I noticed that, of course, and this dichotomy is so clear, and so it is for sure it's something that it's very peculiar of Lucretius' style, and so working on ambivalence and on contrast and also with the double meaning sometimes of things. And yes, of course, it's I think that this kind of argument, so I have the idea that it is, of course, it's a male perspective, and Lucretius wants to say this is a male perspective because it is a social perspective as well. So in the social times we are living in, male as a predominant role, and Ferrum and so it is. So it is predominant, especially for the presence of Durus more than Levis, even if it is always in combination, but there is a predominance of Durus, and especially in the last lines. So the alliteration is so strong, and there is also the figura etymologica here in atque ipsi pariter durum sufferre laborem atque opere in duru durarent membra manusque. It's so intense. So the beginning and the end is like in a recomposition of the aspect of the duritia of the man, and so this is so I think it is another and there is a turning point of the agricola severi. This is a turning point. So like even if for a while women had to focus on this craft that used to be male craft, agricole severi concedere, so they give it the possibility to women to work on it. So it's always male's will. It's something that always is in a male perspective. So I think that so Lucretius is, of course, I don't think it is particularly patriarchal. No, I don't think so. As I strongly believe in Fowler's arguments of saying that he was so critical against the male other side of the aspect of warfare. He was so critical against warfare, Lucretius. But in this sense, not, because durum laborem is something that it is a good quality according to Cato, and so it's and I think that it is just to recognize the ancient values, the ancient mores inside this text. So it's like it's typical of the Republican text to bring back the social ancient mores.
I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, Nicoletta. Obviously, you can speak hours about this text, and we actually need. I don't know if Del has also something to say about this particular question asked by Craig. Sorry to interrupt, Nicoletta.
No,
I guess what I wanted to say was, for me, maybe somebody here will know better, but the cultural history of weaving in Latin literature, I don't think of ferrum as being part of it. So that surprised me that Lucretius introduces ferrum as at the beginning of weaving, and it makes sense in this passage because it gives the image of hardness. But does anybody know here about that? I just had never thought of ferrum associated with weaving.
Well, I mean, I guess the point I was trying to make by connecting this to the genealogy of metallurgy is that while on the one hand it seems like ferrum is the hard the durus material par excellence. Metal is also inherently disobedient of this binary of hard and soft, because you have to harden it to soften it. And iron in particular, in contrast to bronze, iron is something that you don't cast, that you forge. And so it can be soft, but only so soft. It can't get as soft as gold can or as bronze can. And I think in the kind of processual material imaginary of the Roman authors, these qualities inhere in any given, appearance of a given metal. And so the fact that iron sometimes can be softened, I guess, was kind of how I was trying to read this particular cluster of technologies here at the beginning of this, where on the one hand, it does seem like it goes from soft to hard to soft to hard, right? This passage. If you flip it around, you can also look at it from a different angle, and then it flips insofar as the hardness is a quality of doing violence to the natural world that was potentially required to find metal in the first place. And so I do think that while I am interested in the back and forth of these two qualities, I think that they're much more, they're queerer than meets the eye. And I guess a passage that keeps coming to my mind that I'd be curious to hear Nicoletta, your thoughts about in connection to this is Ovid on Deucalion and Pyrrha, because for Deucalion and Pyrrha, they throw the clods of the clods of earth behind them, and right, the wet muddy part becomes our skin, the bones, the stones become the bones, and the metal part, the part that can be bent, flecti, becomes the veins, the blood vessels. And so here, and then that's when Ovid talks about our bodies are already set up already give evidence that we come from durus labor, because we have hard parts in us and sort of medium parts of the bone of the veins. And so I'd be curious, have you thought at all about how this particular Ovidian passage, and then maybe Ovid more broadly, as a reader of materiality, is interfacing with this beyond the really interesting stuff that you did with Arachne?
Yeah, so thank you for your idea. And of course, it's and thank you, Craig, for this, for thinking about more on the presence of iron. So it is so meaningful in this sense. And I was just thinking of other our other texts and in the other texts that mentioned the art of weaving, apart that there are not so many, there is no mention of that, of the materials, especially on the inventors, who were the inventors. I was just thinking of Diodorus, when it describes the discovery of metals, but it didn't relate this discovery to, in the text of Diodorus, no, there is not this kind of relationship with the invention of weaving and this discovery of metals. I think that it is something consequential, but so this is my idea. So my suspicion is that Lucretius always wants to find a logical argument to explain things of the past that normally uses analogy to explain things. And so, but here there is a consequentiality. So it is always in his Kulturgeschichte, everything seems to be a consequence of something. So when he, after talking about writing about the metals, the discovery of metals, it starts the part about the invention and the invention of warfare, and after that, after warfare, it comes the art of weaving. So it is, everything derives from something. It's like a consequential thing, and in this sense, I think that always the male perspective, and so it's just that I cannot mention, I have to mention women because loom and weaving is, of course, associated with women, but it's like, I want to point out, it's like that Lucrezio says, I want to point out that invention belongs to man. All that belongs to invention, all that belongs to ingenium is something male. So this is the idea. So that what I understood in this text.
Okay. I just, I mean, we have really 1 minute, but if someone, I mean, I just wanted to say and reiterate that, of course, this is a multilingual forum, so feel free if you have a question, you are more comfortable, you know, to ask in Italian or in any other language, you are welcome. It doesn't look like there is this urgency. So thank you so much again, both of you, Del and Nicoletta. And I give you, I mean, the next meeting will be on March 10th. That will be Heraclitus, and that will be in Italian again. So thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. I'll see you next time. Have a great evening or day. It depends.
Bye, thank you all.
Thank you.
And sorry again for this technical problem. Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao, ciao a tutti.
Ciao.